What is going on, y'all? Robert Sykes, KetoSavage.com, coming at you with another AMA Ask Me Anything episode. This one is all about higher protein consumption for me during my last prep, how that affected things, how it made me feel, and how it compared to prior preps with a lower protein ratio. So, before we dive into that, let's roll the intro. All right, so this question is brought to us by Heather, and Heather asks, I am curious about your experience with higher protein through your last contest prep. I know in the past that hasn't necessarily been the case. I do understand this prep was much longer for sure, but how was your energy levels and satiation specifically? Congratulations on your season. You killed it. Well, thank you, Heather. All right, so I have done 3 competition prep cycles now with the ketogenic approach. The very first one in 2017, basically, I just started dropping calories from the get-go from both fat and protein. Like, they started off high and they just both whittled down. In 2020 is when I developed the protocol of starting out with a higher fat ratio and then from there simultaneously dropping my dietary fat while increasing my protein to find my own unique protein threshold and then adjusting things accordingly. So I did that in both 2020 and 2023. 2020's shows got canceled due to COVID, so I couldn't really showcase that on stage, but they both worked exceedingly well. Now, the difference between 2020 and 2023's prep is that 2020 was, I believe, a 24-week prep, 22 to 24 weeks if I recall correctly, whereas with the 2023 prep, it was 33 weeks of prep, so a significantly longer prep in all. With that longer prep, what I had to do was basically, I still started with a higher fat ratio of around 80%, but I started with a little bit lower caloric intake because I just wanted to bring this obscene level of conditioning to the stage throughout 2023, which I think I did. But in starting out at about 500 calories lower, what I had to find myself do was, since I started with that lower protein of about 120 grams, if I recall correctly, and I titrated that up from 120 to around, I forget what I capped out at in phase 2, but it was around 200 grams or north of 200 grams. So pretty good ratio relative to what I was consuming in dietary fat. Now, important caveat here is that my percentage of total calories coming from dietary fat was always higher than my protein. So there were times when my protein in grams exceeded my fat in grams for sure. I think I got down to as low as, I want to say 110, 115, 120 grams of fat. But there were times where I was that low in fat, but my protein was quite a bit higher than that. But my total calories coming from fat still exceeded my total calories coming from protein. So that is an important thing to note there. As far as differences between the two, what I have found is that when I am consuming more protein in grams relative to fat, my satiety is not quite there as much. When I'm having a higher fat ratio, I have much more prolonged satiety. I just feel better. I've got more mental acuity. I'm sharper. But in phase 2, as I am increasing protein and dropping fat, I have to figure out where that tipping point for me lies. And since this was a much longer prep, I tried to hold on to as much protein for as long as I could. So I brought that up quite high so that I had much longer runway to taper from it as the prep progressed. And as a result of that, I think I probably had periods of time where I was at a higher protein ratio compared to prior preps. Now, I think it all worked great. I was able to preserve my muscle tissue, my strength. I didn't really see a significant drop in strength until I got towards probably the last month, maybe 6 weeks of this 2023 prep. So I feel really, really good about that. I don't feel like I lost much lean tissue at all. And some of that was because that protein stayed higher for a longer period of time. But also I was just really conscious about training hard, training with intensity, and optimizing my recovery. And I think all that bode well for preserving that lean mass. But to answer your question, in comparing the two, what I have found is that when I am at a higher protein ratio, for me, I don't have the satiety, I don't have the mental acuity, and I don't have the energy that I typically do when I'm at a higher fat ratio with calories equated. Now, obviously, when I'm at a caloric surplus, I've got more energy, I've got more satiety than when I'm in a deficit and depleted. But when calories are equated for, I tend to respond better when my fat ratio is north of 70% of my total calories coming from fat. Honestly, more towards 75% of my total calories coming from fat. Now, here's a very important thing to note as well. The percentage of your total calories coming from fat, if it's going to be higher like that, like 75, you have to make sure you're consuming enough total calories so you're still getting ample protein. If you're only consuming 1,000 calories a day, which I don't recommend for anybody, and 75% of those calories are coming from fat, then your protein by default is going to be very, very low. That's not good. I can maintain a very high fat ratio because I'm consuming a pretty substantial degree of calories overall, so my overall protein intake is still relatively high for my stats, my height, my weight, my lean mass. So keep that in mind. But play around with it. Figure out how different ratios affect you. That's what I've noticed in myself. My sweet spot is between about 70 and 75% of my calories coming from fat. So I would encourage you to just play around with things, tweak things on a gradual basis. People that go from one extreme to the other seemingly overnight, they're never going to be able to fine-tune things because they're not giving their body enough time to establish a baseline and get actionable feedback from it. So that's why I make macronutrient adjustments on a week-by-week basis, but it's always in intervals of like 5 or 10 grams, 15 grams at most. Like, it's very gradual when I've got a specific goal in mind. So take the time, be very gradual and incremental with your changes. Start at a higher fat ratio to optimize fat metabolism. Titrate that fat down, that protein up to find your own unique protein threshold, and then taper both down as calories continue to drop if you're trying to optimize from a fat loss phase standpoint. So that would be my response to you, Heather. Thank you so very much for the question. You requested some milk and cookies keto bricks, so I'm shipping those out to you tomorrow. So you should be getting those very soon. For anybody that doesn't know how these AMA videos work, if you submit me a well thought out question via the link in the description below and I use your question, then I will be sending you some free keto bricks with a flavor of your choosing. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. Talk to you next time.